on this. Okay. And then I can get this down so I don't, okay. So again, welcome and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's lecture. My name is Barbara Berthold. I'm a professor at the Department of Modern Languages at the University of Texas at Arlington. And today I'm here as your host, and I'm representing my department, who is a co-sponsor, but also the German-Texan Heritage Society. I serve on the board, and it is a pleasure to put on this lecture today for you. Again, thank you for coming. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the GTHS, the German-Texan Heritage Society. We strive to preserve as the history and the heritage of German Texans, but we also strive to make connections to today's German Texan community as well as to Germany. And to that end, we offer a wide variety of events and programming, and most of them are free or at minimal cost to our participants. So we offer German language classes for children as well as for adults. We have a host of festivals. Mayfest is coming up pretty soon. We do economic and political roundtables, as well as an annual conference on Texas German history. And for about a year, 2 years now, we have operated also a school for children from pre-K to first grade, actually in the Austin area. And you can check out all of this on our website. I'll post it in the chat later on. And today you are participating in one of our programs. It's the Speakers series. And I'm honored to introduce today's speaker to you and to us, to you all. This is Walter Kamphoefner, and Dr. Kamphoefner earned his PhD at the University of Missouri-Columbia in 1978 and arrived in 1988 at Texas A&M, where he is now a professor of history. He teaches in the field of immigration history and the US Civil War. And he spent 3-year-long guest professorships at German universities, 2 on Fulbright lectureships, and served as president of the Society for German American Studies from 2015 to 2017. Dr. Kamphoefner has published widely in the field of immigration and ethnicity, with articles in 4 languages and 3 books out in both German and English versions. And his latest co-edited book work is Preserving German-Texan Identity, Reminiscences of William A. Trankman, 1859 to 1935. And the latest book, Germans in America, A Concise History, surveys the sweep of the German-American experience over more than 300 years. And it's a really nice book to read. Dr. Kamphoefner is also a longtime supporter and friend of GTHS, and we are very honored to have him here with us tonight, where he will talk about the 1848 revolution in Texas, the Black German Republican Reconstruction era alliance, and progressive politics in Texas. So thank you again, Walter, for joining us tonight, and welcome. The floor is yours. Oh, we need to unmute you as first. Let me see. You are muted. Let me.
Am I on?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for the kind introduction. Since it seems important to some Texans, let me admit at the outset, like every Anglo who died at the Alamo, I wasn't born in Texas, but I've lived here longer than anywhere else. And by now, I know the Texas Germans as well are better than the Germans of my native Missouri that I studied earlier in my career. In the course on Civil War and Reconstruction that I offer at Texas A&M, I show my students this cartoon at the outset. Come on. There you go. In a way, it's a bit sad that my field of study seems to have become more relevant and controversial rather than less with the passage of time. I also tell my students when so many Americans killed each other, at least 620,000 and maybe as many as 750,000, it's important to go beyond who shot whom, when, and where, and try to get at the why, and also what this huge loss of life accomplished in the long run. Finally, despite the narrative of the solid, that is white South, that lost causers have promoted, it's important to give Southern dissenters their due, as we did in this 2016 anthology from which my presentation is largely drawn. Now, if all you knew about German immigrant Louis Lehman was what appeared in his obituary in 1904, you might think he was a gung-ho Confederate. The English language newspaper in Brenham reported, "He's seen service in the Confederate Army, was true to his colors, and made an enviable reputation as a soldier by the promptness and fearlessly," that's what they said, "with which he discharged every duty assigned to him. He was a member of Washington Camp number 239 and was warm and fraternal in his love and veneration for his old comrades." Fortunately, in Lehman's case, a number of his letters have survived, so we know better. As he wrote in 1866, "The conscription, which was hard enough at the beginning, ultimately turned into pure despotism. No one below age 50 was spared. Dear brother-in-law, as unwilling as I was, I also had to join the army and fight for a cause that I had never approved of." So if you have German Confederates in your family, you shouldn't necessarily assume that they were enthusiastic about the rebel cause or that they believed in it at all, even if their descendants try to retrofit them into the Texas majority. Back in 2011, I had a Czech doctoral student who was also a Civil War reenactor. Never knew they did that in Europe, but I found out. Anyhow, he was studying with me and didn't have a car, so I drove him to Austin for research and stopped off to show him a little Czech cemetery of the SPJST fraternal organization a few miles west of Caldwell. Seeing two graves with Confederate veteran markers, he broke out laughing. "Why, those guys were both deserters." Already during peacetime, the slaveholding South had little use for such constitutional rights as freedom of expression, where the subject of slavery was involved. Even before the war, Germans and even Czechs were harassed for their association with, quote, abolitionist foreign language newspapers, like from St. Louis, claiming that they might stir up slave rebellions. Now, there might have been one or two blacks in antebellum Texas who could read German, but I can assure you that there was not a single one that could read Czech. So even if few Germans spoke up against slavery, that did not mean that the rest of them approved. And the few who were quite vocal in their opposition, especially refugees from the 1848 revolution, a failed attempt to create a unified and more democratic Germany. Although technically not 48ers, as a group of 40 immigrants known as the 40er, German for 40, who arrived in 1847, a year before the revolution, but they had much in common with the 48ers. Where they're a bit like the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, who fought against Franco in Spain and were later criticized for being premature anti-fascists. Both groups were well-educated, tended towards free thinking or religious rationalism, and progressive politics on issues of slavery and race. Besides Gustav Schleicher, who in 15 years underwent a remarkable transformation from a communist to a Confederate, if you know German, Schleicher means skulker or a sneaky guy or something like that, nominist omen. Well, besides him, the two most prominent of this group were the distinguished surgeon, Dr. Ferdinand Herf, and Jacob Küchler, who was second in command of the Unionists at the Battle of Nueces, which I'll say more about later, but most of you probably know. One of the 48ers, Edward Degener, first got involved in American politics with an anti-slavery speech at the controversial 1854 San Antonio Convention held in conjunction with the Zengerfest. Another 48er, Adolphe Douay, promoted this abolitionist platform in his San Antonio newspaper and ended up being hounded out of Texas in 1856. Now, a lot of Texas Germans also criticized Douay, but less because they disagreed with his critique of slavery than because it was just dangerous to say that something like that out loud. Many of these activists were closely networked with each other. Another 48er involved in the anti-slavery protest was August Siemering. Although he served reluctantly in the Confederate Army, he went on to found the San Antonio Freie Presse in 1865, one of the leading Republican papers in the state, and was associated also with the San Antonio Express, another Republican paper. He was married to Louise Schütze, who was the daughter of 48er Louis Schütze, who was murdered by a pro-Confederate Hengerbende, as they were called, in 1864. Lewis's brother Julius was the founder of the German English School in Austin, where the German-Texan Heritage Society now has its headquarters. In fact, on Thursday evening, we're, having a reception there. Another son-in-law of Schütze, Philip Braubach, who arrived in 1850 and served in the Union Texas Cavalry, avenged himself on Hengerbende leader James Waldrip in a shootout on the streets of Fredericksburg in 1867, although someone else fired the fatal shot. Now, returning to the subject of secession, when given the vote, Germans' true attitudes emerge. While older scholarly accounts often portray Germans as largely Unionists and abolitionists in sentiment, more recent scholars have pushed back and cautioned against generalizing from a few radical 48ers to the bulk of ordinary Germans. But maybe they've gone too far in their attempt to place Texas Germans into the Lone Star mainstream. The late great UT geographer Terry Jordan has pointed out important distinctions between Eastern and Western Texas Germans as far as attitudes toward slavery in the Civil War is concerned. Differences that had more to do with economic interests than moral or political principles. Eastern settlements were older, their immigrants more acculturated to American values, their local economy well suited for plantation agriculture and slavery. The hill country west of Austin, by contrast, was more recently settled. With its semi-arid ranching economy, it had very few slaveholders, Anglo or German. A frontier region, it was exposed to dangers of Indian attacks should federal military protection be withdrawn. In one work, Jordan outlines 4 what he calls myths or stereotypes regarding Texas Germans: that they, 1, did not own slaves, 2, favored the abolitionist cause, 3, were morally opposed to slavery, and 4, harbored Unionist settlements, all of which he claimed were, quote, inaccurate when applied to, quote, many or most ordinary Texas Germans. While Jordan's certainly correct in pointing out that Germans were never fully united on any of these issues, in fact, on practically nothing except maybe beer, he goes too far in his revisions and exaggerates the degree to which Germans agreed with Anglo-Texans on issues such as slavery, race, secession, and the Civil War. Neither Jordan nor anyone else had dug deeply into the local press for precinct-level voting returns or other evidence of German attitudes toward the Confederacy, nor had anyone examined closely the patterns of German slaveholding in relation to overall property holdings. It took a Missouri German named Kamphoefner to do that. Although geographic conditions in the hill country may have discouraged slavery, Jordan's own work shows that in 3 counties where 11% of the Anglo families owned slaves, not a single German did. According to German, lack of capital was the main factor restricting slave owning among Germans in the eastern parts of Texas. And indeed, a recent study has documented some 60 Germans in the older settlements of Austin, Fayette, and Colorado counties, that is, around LaGrange or Belleville or Columbus, an hour's drive south of Aggieland, maybe an hour west of Houston, who did own slaves between 1840 and 1865. Still, despite the strong presence of Germans in these counties, they made up less than 5% of the local slave owners. And it's not just because Germans were poor. If you group people by wealth categories, as you see there, at every level from top to bottom, a higher proportion of Anglos than Germans owned slaves. For example, among people worth from $3,000 to $6,000 in those periods, should be dashes there at the scale at the bottom. Over half the Anglos, but barely 2% of the Germans were slaveholders. People in the servant-keeping class in Germany, especially those of the nobility, were especially prone to slaveholding, but even among the wealthy, worth over $15,000, only half of the Germans owned slaves, but 92% of the Anglos did. Moreover, the size of the slave holdings were smaller among Germans, who made up 4% of the slave owners, but possessed only 2% of the slaves in the area. Contrast to this magnitude could hardly have arisen without a conscious choice by many or most Germans against human property. Indeed, Jordan's own figures show that Texas Germans were more likely to be landowners than their Anglo neighbors, further evidence that it wasn't mere poverty that prevented them from owning slaves. My earlier work on Missouri Germans documents similar patterns, as do other studies of Charleston, South Carolina, and of 5 mid-sized southern cities. Germans ranked even behind the Irish in the proportion of slave owners. So geography was important, but ethnicity and culture were more important. Even the few Germans who did own slaves didn't appear particularly wedded to the peculiar institution. The only German slaveholder in New Braunfels, a prominent Jewish merchant named Joseph Landa, who gave his name to a public park that he donated there, freed his 5 slaves immediately in 1863 when he received word of the Emancipation Proclamation, evoking such ill will among his Confederate neighbors that he fled to Mexico and spent the rest of the war there. One of the rare firsthand accounts is by an immigrant who arrived in Washington County near Brenham in 1850 and wrote in February 1861 that he had bought a, quote, slave or, quote, black man, which he explained on purely economic grounds. Quote, "This is my own as long as he lives, and when I die, my children will inherit him. So you can be sure that he is worth as much as 2 hired hands." But even such a German expressed little regret at the demise of slavery, an institution he identified primarily with Anglo-Americans, as he stated in a letter of 1866. The Americans almost all had Negroes because whoever had a lot of Negroes, he was rich. They had to do all the work because the Americans, they don't like to work. He did justify slavery with the biblical curse of Ham, but he also remarked with a touch of schadenfreude, the Americans can't get along with the Negroes now, but they don't like to work themselves. Several pieces of evidence suggest that domestic service was a primary reason Germans held slaves. The small number per owner would point in that direction, and the fact that a lot of them were female. So would the fact that several German slave owners in Missouri and Texas turned out to be outspoken Unionists and emancipationists and radical Republicans, among them Galveston editor Ferdinand Flake. He owned a female domestic with 3 children, but he still edited a German newspaper with the telling name Die Union, the Union, which, because of its, quote, warning voice, was subjected to, quote, threats, intimidations of all kind, and even open violence, as Flacker wrote when he resumed publication after a 3-year suspension. The secession referendum of 23 February 1861 provides a good measure of Texas German attitudes toward Southern independence and institutions. It's important to remember that Germans and Anglos, Unionists, were not the natural allies you might suppose. Many Anglo-Unionists had earlier expressed their nationalism in the form of nativism, especially during the Know-Nothing movement of the mid-1850s. Thus, Germans were faced with a devil's choice between an alliance with Southern fire eaters or with political opponents of the foreign barn. Across Texas, secession won by a landslide with not quite a quarter of the voters opposing. In an appeal to ethnic voters, the Declaration of Secession had been printed not only in 10,000 English copies, but 2,000 each in Spanish, which you see here, and German. There you go. But these copies largely fell on deaf ears. 2 German frontier counties, Gillespie and Mason, you can see them there, the farthest west ones, northwest, led the state with a 96% margin against secession. Here you can see also counties that oppose secession by 40% or more, and you can see what a compact block, 2 of them, one in the German Hill Country and one up on the Red River. But getting back to the exact voting returns there, some largely Anglo counties in the region in West Texas also turned in majorities against secession, but wherever you got precinct level returns, they show the German communities of a county to be the most hostile to secession. In Kerr County, the German community around Comfort, soon to become Kendall County, voted nearly 2/3 against secession, actually a surprisingly small margin considering its later resistance to the Confederate cause. But the Anglo half of the frontier county went 10-1 for secession. San Antonio, home to the largest number of Germans in the state, and particularly its most German ward, opposed disunion to the tune of 60%, though they obviously had some Hispanic and also Anglo help. After the election, German city councilors still resisted for several months demands to turn over seized federal arms to the secessionists. Even older Texas German settlements farther east show little evidence of enthusiasm for secession. The 64% support level in Colorado County, for example, masks an internal polarization. 3 precincts with German names, Frelsburg, Weimar, and Mentz, voted 86% against secession, while 5 Anglo precincts cast all but 6 votes in favor. Only the county seat, with its mixed population, was around average. In the area that later became Lee County, Wendish Lutherans and German Methodists in Bastrop County united despite their religious differences in almost unanimous opposition to secession. Though there were some Anglo-Unionists, it was the Germans who tipped the scales to give the county a majority against secession. Similarly, in Fayette County, don't have precincts there, but some Anglos must have contributed to the narrow margin opposing secession, but a local paper with the telling name States' Rights Democrat blamed the, quote, sauerkraut dirt eaters. It pilloried a Texas revolutionary veteran they called Benedict Arnold Grassmeyer for deceiving, quote, the honest Germans of Fayette County in the election, and for his abolitionist sympathies and friendliness toward blacks. Only in Austin County, there at the top, did close to half of the Germans vote for Southern independence, which is Still a rather lukewarm result compared to the 96% level in 6 Anglo precincts. One of the state's oldest settlements, Industry, did vote almost unanimously for secession, for which a prominent German slaveholder named Ernst Knolle had, quote, worked manfully. This might seem to confirm Jordan's assertion that over time, Germans became increasingly acculturated to the Southern way of life. But before jumping to conclusions, you should note that the neighboring settlement of Cat Springs, which also predated Texas independence, took a diametrically opposite position, weighing in at 92% against secession. Another of the county precincts in New Ulm, which produced a slight majority for secession, had gone 52-1 against it in a preliminary election the December before. The stance in New Braunfels and the rest of Comal County, the only German area of the Hill Country to vote strongly in favor of secession, has been widely misunderstood. It was largely the work of one man, reflecting trust in the advice of the venerable Ferdinand Lindheimer in his New Braunfelser Zeitung. What was the basis for editor Lindheim's position? Enthusiasm for slavery or the Confederacy? Although he himself probably became a reluctant supporter of secession, he seldom attempts to sell his readers on the merits of the case, stressing instead the reprisals Germans might suffer if they should be perceived as opposing it. When in Texas, do as the Texans do. Anything else is suicide and brings tragedy on all our Texas Germans, he wrote. In general, the factor of intimidation must be kept in mind when examining Texas German behavior in the winter of disunion. Although Galveston was nearly 1/3 German and home to Unionist editor Ferdinand Flake, with a low turnout, it voted 96% in favor of secession. Mob violence had destroyed one of Flake's presses a month before and sent an unmistakable message to Unionists. Terry Jordan calls New Braunfels a secessionist hotbed. In fact, it is one of the few places in Texas where Confederate sympathizers were subject to intimidation. Editor Lindheimer's pragmatism was not universally appreciated. In June of 1863, he noted, "Remarkable is the hatred which many people here now exhibit against the original secessionists." Even 90 years later, the centennial issue of his paper admitted, because of its strong Southern tendencies during the war, the New Braunfelser Zeitung attracted the bitter enmity of the loyally Union part of the German population in West Texas, and especially in Comal County, which made the further existence of the paper nearly impossible. So incensed were some New Braunfelsers that they threw the press and type into the Comal River. But Lindheimer fished it out of the clear water, now so beloved by inner tubers, so that the paper didn't miss a single issue. But his windows were stoned in twice and his dogs poisoned with strychnine. Throughout the war, his paper manifests a profoundly defensive tone in matters involving the Confederacy. Even with the support given by the local German press, the secession cause received slightly less support at the polls in New Braunfels than in Texas, as a whole, like 26% versus 24%. The only homogeneous German county or German precinct where German support for secession exceeded the statewide average was the settlement of Industry. With respect to unionism, Terry Jordan states that Texas Germans were split, quote, just as Anglo-Americans were. Both were indeed split, but there the similarities end. With Anglos, there was a 3-1 majority for secession, while Germans turned in a majority for the Union and many stay-at-homes as well. Willingness to serve in the Confederate military provides yet another measure of attitudes of Texas Germans. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Texas Germans faced an unenviable choice, to go or to stay. flight from the Confederacy was theoretically possible, but the experience of those who tried it probably gave pause to many others. It took a strong dose of ideological conviction, especially if it involved abandoning hard-earned property, farms that had been laboriously hacked out of the post oaks, and leaving wife and children to an uncertain fate. Consequently, Texas Germans in the Union Army were obviously outnumbered by German Confederates. Now, I did a quick and dirty estimate of ethnic loyalties by searching for common Anglo and German names on Union and Confederate muster rolls in Texas on Ancestry. Of every Texas soldier named Smith or Jones on our National Park Service database of Civil War soldiers, one finds that less than 1% of them served the Union. But searching for two of the leading German names, Schmidt and Meyer, reveals that those who rendered military service, 1 in 9, remained true to the Union. People with the common Hispanic names of Garcia and Martinez showed much greater Union affiliation, 43%. But for Hispanics, Union enlistment didn't require a perilous journey through several hundred miles of brush country to Brownsville, as it did for Texas Germans. Still, this issue bears further investigation. Above all, the question of how many Germans enlisted in the rebel ranks before April 1862, when Confederate conscription took effect. Now, I always say I can do history by the numbers or the letters, so now let me switch to the letters, which you'll probably find more interesting anyhow. Louis Lehman, whom I mentioned at the outset, wrote his wife in August 1863. The colonel lined up the regiment and announced that he had reports from Galveston that our troops on the island, 3 regiments, had rebelled, and that the Yankees could easily occupy the island if they found out. Therefore, he appealed to every Texan who was true to his state to step forward voluntarily and hurry to Galveston with him. About 200 men stepped forward from the line. We Germans just stood still, and about 80 Americans too. Since Lehman was writing his wife in German, he could be fairly candid without fear of censorship. He advised her after the South resorted to its galloping inflation by imposing taxes in kind. As far as the corn for the government, the tithe, don't have it delivered. If the government wants to steal the corn from the soldiers' wives, let them come and get it. You can't just take it to them. Let the gentlemen Negro holders who are sitting around at home do something too. Lehman's attitude toward his Confederate officers bordered on contempt, as he wrote his wife. Now that we've had the chance to get to know our commanding officers better, I must say that we are out of the frying pan and into the fire. For when we had that night march and the rear guard came along at the back, they saw a human figure. They saw a human figure next to the horse that was standing still, lying in a mud hole. They pulled the man out of the mud, no way. They saw it was our colonel. He was dead drunk and out cold. They left him lying there. The lieutenant colonel barely managed to escape the noose because years ago he had rented out his field to someone else, and then he wanted to run him off because he wanted to rent it out to another man who offered more money. And so he shot the first renter 6 times with his Sechsshooter, S-C-H-S-C-H-U-T-E-R. That's Texas German for 6-shooter. Returning home after a stint as a Union POW, Lehman sat out the last 6 months of the war with, as he put it, intentional illness. Incidentally, a descendant who was himself a World War II vet published Lehman's letters in their entirety as its own book. He was initially rather troubled to discover that his great-grandpa was somewhat of a slacker or deserter until I pointed out to him that it depended on whether you considered the Confederacy to be a legitimate government. Obviously, Louis Lehman did not. He was quite pleased with the outcome of the war. Quote, "The existence of the United States stands more firmly than ever before. The stumbling block of slavery is cleared out of the way." Opinion that most of his neighbors shared. Quote, No element of the population reduced more about peace than the Germans, since they never had any interest in the cause anyhow. Now, this was not universally true. With William Trankman, whose memoir I co-edited, two of his brothers enlisted early and voluntarily, but two others were drafted late and reluctantly. So, you know, the divisions ran right through families. There was one German company raised by Brenham merchant George Merrill that was formed rather early and served in the 16th Texas Infantry of the Confederacy. New Braunfels also had at least one such early company, but there was no German regiment among Texas Confederates. The nearest thing to it was Wall's Legion, which had 3 German companies recruited from the older settlements around Austin County and Houston. But they were not formed until the Confederacy had instituted conscription in April 1862. The first Austin County company, mustered in October 1861, was virtually devoid of Germans. When service appeared inevitable, Germans enlisted in order to serve with comrades and under officers they knew and trusted, more than from dedication to the Confederate cause. Even one of the sergeants, William Hander, proves in his diary entries to be at odds with the basis of Southern civilization. Quote, "Several plantations made a pleasant scene, but certainly not inviting when one thinks of the Negro whips that are so often used." Captain Robert Voigt of Industry, who raised one of the companies, wrote home in February of '63, quote, "The Germans in general, and here with us in another company, who are mostly from our neighborhood, conduct themselves on various occasions so that one has to be ashamed." Voigt was obviously more committed to the Confederate cause than the average German, but he was by no means a fire eater. One of his letters indicates that he had considered whether his position as postmaster would exempt him from military service. His company was on detached service at the fall of Vicksburg, so instead of being paroled, he ended up in a Union prison. There, a number of Germans, quote, "took the oath to the Union," including Voigt himself in February of '65, and became what they called galvanized Yankees. In the beautiful little cemetery of Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Round Top, worth a visit, folks, if you've never been there, the gravestone of Carl Bauer notes his Confederate unit and the fact that his letters had been acquired by the state archives. Thinking I might at last have finally located an enthusiastic German rebel, I ordered a copy of the letter translations from the archives. Almost from the beginning to end, their tone is one of pious resignation. Traugott, trust in God, was his middle name, along with war weariness. Already in December '62, Bauer writes, "War enthusiasm is cooling. Many of our men do not believe the South can win." In April, he reports from Louisiana, half of our men volunteered to go on the ship Alexandria, there to try to add luster and fame to their name on the water. As I was not in the mood for great military laurels, I decided to stay on land. After hearing of the fall of Vicksburg, he writes, "We are all tired to death of war. I believe our beloved South is whipped." This one adjective, beloved, is the nearest indication of support for the cause that can be found in dozens of his letters home. According to Terry Jordan, many or most Texas Germans became, quote, "inaccurately stereotyped as Unionists because of a single incident, the 1862 shootout on the Nueces that most Germans called a massacre, which is commemorated by the Toya de Union monument in Comfort." But here, too, regional contrast to Texas Germans can be exaggerated. It was not only Gillespie or Kendall counties in the Hill Country, but the eastern counties of Austin, Fayette, and Colorado that were placed under martial law in January '63 because of German draft resistance. A list of 32 draft resistors from Austin County including only 4 with Anglo names. The rest were all German and Czech. A resistance meeting held over the 1863 New Year's holidays at the central location of Raiders Mill, present-day Shelby, attracted 400 to 600 Germans from 5 counties. Victoria and DeWitt counties inland from Corpus Christi produced only a 15% opposition to the secession vote, despite a German population probably twice that high. They also contributed a company and a half to the 6th Texas Infantry. But here too, a closer examination reveals contrast between Germans and Anglos. In January 63, when the regiment was captured at Arkansas Post, 152 of its men, mostly Germans and Poles, took an oath of allegiance to the United States. Captain C.P. Nauheim resigned his commission because his German Company I had virtually disappeared. And of course, the Torre de Union monument at Comfort stands out as the only memorial to Unionists erected by local residents on the soil of the former Confederacy, at least in the 19th century. The contrast between Germans and Anglo-Texans persisted into the Reconstruction era and sometimes beyond. Whatever their positions on secession or during the war, New Braunfels residents took a distinctly un-Southern view of the occupying federal troops in its aftermath. If General Sheridan had made his headquarters there, he might have preferred Texas to hell after all. When one Anglo-Yankee from the 59th Illinois said goodbye in December of 1865, he noted in his diary, "Some of them shed tears almost. I never felt so bad at leaving any place as that, except home in 1861. Farewell, Braunfels." 2 days later, he recorded presents from New Braunfels friends received. His was not an isolated case. At least 2 other Anglo members of his regiment married local girls and settled permanently there. Less than 3 months after Lee's surrender, New Braunfels had celebrated the 4th of July and sounded what sounded like a huge sigh of relief. The stars and stripes were unfurled from the highest hill. A marching band led a well-attended parade throughout the town, and a number of dances rounded out the evening and the next day. The fact that even San Antonio, with its considerable Union element, didn't risk an official celebration of the 4th shows how unusual New Braunfels' festivities were, although New Ulm did something similar. But in Vicksburg, admittedly something of a special case because it surrendered on July 4th, the first time Independence Day was celebrated by whites after the Civil War was, get this, 1942. George Schwarting's letters show a similar tone. An early immigrant to Texas who happened to be in Germany when the war broke out, he briefly joined the Union Army on his return trip in 1864, but as a bounty jumper, deserter, his loyalty was rather ambivalent. But his reaction to the war's outcome was unambiguous, as one sees in his letter from Round Top to his brother back in Germany in early 1866. Quote, "The blood was not shed in vain. Slavery has ceased. How the Negro will get along as a free laborer, time will tell. Anyhow, they are free, and the 10 bottles of wine that I bet on it with Lerniker, I gave away with no little delight. And when you get a chance, you can drink up some of it to the blessings of freedom and the health of the United States." Schwarting's comments on violence during Reconstruction implied that Blacks and Germans were allies, or at least that they had common enemies. In May 1866, he remarked, "It's really high time we get an energetic government in order to put an end to the rowdyism. The Germans suffer most from it." And 3 months later, "It's getting more serious all the time here with the rowdy bands. The Negroes are primarily the ones who suffer from it. Many have been murdered, and the perpetrators always get off free." Obviously, he didn't consider federal occupation to be oppressive, as he related in May 1867. "We remain under military rule to no little dismay of the Americans. But even the 40 soldiers who are stationed just in our town of Round Top can hardly maintain the peace. And if you know Round Top, it still hasn't broken 100 inhabitants to this day. A book on violence in the Hill Country, based on a University of Texas dissertation that I helped supervise, found that violence against blacks in nearby Austin County was only 1/4 as high as the murder rates in the Anglo counties of Brazoria and Brazos. In fact, the author found that only 2 of the 79 incidents of violence against blacks in these heavily German Austin, Colorado, and Schwartings-Fayette counties were committed by Germans. An early German slaveholder named Bartels from Schwarting's hometown in Germany is mentioned frequently in his letters, for example, in Christmas of '67. With old Bartels, everything is still like before, only their log cabins are increasingly falling into disrepair, and the 2 old folks now have to work their farm alone, cut off from the world and humanity, enriched from year to year only by a few new wrinkles in their faces. Well, as it turned out, they were neither all alone, nor were they burdened by poverty. I happened to read in a 1930 local history the following. The Bartels were childless and had purchased a slave boy who had learned their language and loved them like their own child. After Mr. Bartels died and his wife was bedridden with a stroke for 2 years until her death, she was faithfully cared for by this former slave and his wife. The Bartels' will left their entire property to this freedman, Henry Williams, who in 1930 was reportedly still in possession of the farm and a bundle of old German letters, which he greatly treasured. Now, I'm always skeptical of stories like this tinged with the Magnolia myth. But then it occurred to me that I had actually read some of Bartels' German letters at the archives there on the UT campus. A brief email exchange confirmed my hunch. Gift of Annie and Henry Williams, Industry, Texas. Other parts of the story are confirmed in a number of manuscript census entries down to 1930, which all show Williams as a mortgage-free farm owner. The political attitudes of Texas Germans in the aftermath of the war likewise set them apart from the bulk of their Anglo counterparts. 48er Edward Degener, who lost 2 sons in the Nueces massacre, was one of the strongest supporters of black voting rights in both of the 2 Texas constitutional conventions during Reconstruction. He represented the San Antonio area as a Republican in the first Texas congressional delegation after the Civil War. Even in areas farther east where it required considerable cooperation with blacks, Germans were among the strongest white supporters of the Republican Party. When the legislature took up public education in August of 1870, one saw the German names of Prissig, Schlickum, Schlottmann, Schütze, Zapp, and Zoller lined up with the 2 black House members in an effort to table an amendment requiring racial segregation in schools. The measure came within 1 vote of being tabled. If there had been no blacks or Germans in the legislature, it wouldn't have even been close. And Fredericksburg ignored the segregation order anyway. And by the way, Zoller was one of the 40, and Schütze and Zapp were 48ers, while Schlickum was the brother of another 48er. 2 adjacent counties, Colorado and Washington, remained under Republican control well beyond what's called the end of Reconstruction and into the 1880s, in both cases, largely a result of a black-German coalition. After the war, the first time Colorado County went Democratic in a gubernatorial or presidential race was 1888. Washington County, with close to a black majority and a sizable German minority in its population, was represented in the first Reconstruction Texas legislature by a black senator, Matt Gaines, also responsible for sponsoring A&M and Prairie View, and in the lower house by a German Confederate veteran, Louis Lehman's comrade, Wilhelm Schlottmann. Like Gaines, a radical Republican. Further evidence that Confederate service didn't necessarily indicate identification with the Southern cause. Support for this coalition by the local German press was criticized in the rabidly anti-Black and anti-Republican rival, the Brenham Banner, in a January 76 column. What does the Volksbote think of the idea of consolidating the German vote of this county with Negro radical swindlers? Washington County remained under Republican control until 1884. Supported by the bulk of the blacks, about half of the Germans, and a few white Anglos, often a unionist background. As long as they held on, blacks served as deputy sheriffs and on juries, giving them a relatively fair shake in the local justice system. A democratic takeover in 1884 could only be accomplished through what I call domestic terrorism against blacks, and an attempted Republican comeback in the extremely close election of 1886 was foiled when Democrats stole 3 Republican ballot boxes, lynched 3 Black Republicans, and ran 3 of their prominent white allies out of the country. Alle gute Dinge sind drei, the Germans say. Good things come in 3. Bad things as well, apparently. At least one of the exiles was German, Karl Schütze, who had been the radical or Republican candidate for county attorney already in 1876. In 1888, Schütze wrote from his California exile to Louis Lehman's brother Julius, who had helped finance his Brenham newspaper. It's totally different for me here than back there. Here, it is no crime to be a Republican, and they don't sling mud at you for it. The Republican Party in Washington County is done for once and for all. The mobsters have complete control, and everything will probably be quiet and still. In an August letter, he goes on in more detail. I fear that in this election, the mob will put on the same show that we experienced 2 years ago. Violence and intimidation will be their main weapons again. What does the mob need to worry about the consequences? The officials, that is, of the county, are all the main instigators and leaders of this murderous gang. I can imagine these are just the rascals who are doing their best to play themselves up as the friends of the Germans and stir up the Germans against the Negroes, just as they stir up the Negroes against the Germans. You feel entirely different out here than in Texas. Besides, here you live among respectable people and don't have to deal with rowdies and murderers. Sorry about that if you're a Texan, but that's what he said. One additional indicator of relatively friendly relations between Germans is the number of blacks who learned the German language. For example, that's what Karl Schurz reported in 1867 when he visited my hometown of Augusta, Missouri. There were similar reports from Texas, though with the notorious black Fredericksburger, who during World War I was quoted as saying, "Wir Deutschen müssen zusammenhalten." We Germans got to stick together. German was literally his mother tongue. He was of mixed parentage. What's more surprising is to find similar patterns farther east in Texas, areas with a larger black population that were not so overwhelmingly German, for example, industry, the oldest German settlement in the state. A woman from Bavaria, whose master's work I supervised at the University of Houston in the early 90s, interviewed an old black gentleman named Woody Williams, born around 1928, who still spoke fluent German. He died in 2010, probably the last of his kind. However, a German linguist named David Hünlich, whom I sponsored here, investigated the subject more broadly and found more German-speaking blacks than either he or I had expected at the outset. If anything, the Germans farther west in Texas stood apart even more from their Anglo neighbors in political and racial attitudes. Gillespie County, Greater Fredericksburg, the most heavily German county in Texas, remained an unwavering Republican stronghold. Except for 1932, when it supported FDR to get their beer back, the first time they voted Democratic in the 20th century was for local boy LBJ in 1964. Now, beginning in 1920, Harry Wurzbach served for over a decade representing the San Antonio Seguin area in the U.S. House. He was the only congressman from the Deep South to vote in favor of an anti-lynching bill that passed the House in 1922, only to be buried in the Senate. He did not apologize for his vote, and he was reelected in the fall with only a 1.2 percentage point decline from the previous election, and he continued to serve as the only Republican congressman from Texas till his death in 1931. It took until 1955 when the next Texas Republican entered Congress, but he was a stark contrast from Wurzbach's profile and courage, voting against the Civil Rights Acts of 1957, 1960, and 1964, as well as the 24th Amendment, abolishing the poll tax, which was long used to hinder Black voting. So when did Texas Germans join the political mainstream? In the 1920s, when the Texas Klan was crusading against the German language, New Braunfels defiantly named a new school after Carl Schurz, not just a German, but a Yankee general and a Republican politician. In the 30s, the town finally got around to erecting the obligatory Civil War statue on the courthouse square, but rather than portraying a rebel, it was a generic soldier dedicated to both sides. When the Supreme Court passed the Brown decision, New Braunfels integrated its schools immediately in 1954, just like my little German hometown of Augusta, Missouri. Having largely avoided slavery a century earlier, Comal County had a Black population of only 2%. But New Braunfels clearly stood apart. Even a decade later, less than 6% of all Black Texans were attending integrated schools. Maybe Texas Germans never quite joined the mainstream. Instead, the mainstream joined them. When the Democrats replaced the Republicans as a party of the civil rights in the area of LBJ, Hill Country Germans remained Republican for reasons having little to do with race, soon to be joined by the majority of white Texans for reasons having a lot to do with race. Normal white Texans at last, unfortunately. So that's all I have. 8 o'clock on the dot, so we can go over to questions.